Here's a question that might surprise you. Was colonial America, with no professional police force, actually safer than modern America with its extensive law enforcement infrastructure? It sounds counterintuitive. We've spent 29 episodes exploring the chaos, violence, and injustice that characterized colonial justice systems. We've examined serial killers who evaded capture for years, vigilante mobs that executed innocent people, corrupt officials who sold justice to the highest bidder, and communities that turned a blind eye to domestic violence and racial violence. Surely such a society must have been drowning in crime, right? But here's the uncomfortable truth that historical records reveal. In many respects, colonial America was remarkably orderly. Homicide rates in some colonial communities were lower than in comparable modern American cities. Property crime was often less frequent. Many communities functioned quite well without professional law enforcement. So was the absence of police actually a problem? Or have we been asking the wrong question all along? Welcome to the final episode of our series, where we confront the most challenging question of all. Did colonial America's lack of police lead to higher crime rates, or were communities able to self-regulate more effectively than we've assumed? Before we can assess whether colonial America had high or low crime rates, we must confront a fundamental problem. Measuring crime in an era with no professional police, inconsistent record-keeping, and vast regional variations is extraordinarily difficult. Unlike modern society, where police departments maintain detailed crime statistics, colonial America left us with fragmentary evidence. Court records that capture only prosecuted crimes, newspaper accounts that focused on sensational cases, personal diaries that reflected individual perspectives, and church records that documented moral offenses. Much crime went unrecorded entirely, either because it was unreported, handled informally, or occurred in frontier areas with no record-keeping infrastructure. Historians have developed methodologies to estimate colonial crime rates using available sources, but all such estimates come with significant uncertainty. What we can say with confidence is that crime patterns varied enormously by region, time period, and type of community. Colonial America wasn't monolithic. Crime rates and social order varied dramatically between regions. New England, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire. These tightly knit, religiously homogeneous communities generally maintained low crime rates. Puritan social control, community surveillance, and strong social cohesion created environments where serious crime was relatively rare. Court records from 17th-century Massachusetts show homicide rates of approximately 1 per 100,000 people annually, lower than most modern American cities. The Middle Colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, more diverse and commercial than New England, these colonies experienced moderate crime rates. Philadelphia and New York developed reputations for property crime and disorder, particularly in waterfront districts. Yet even these urban areas maintained order reasonably well through night watches, constables, and community regulation. The southern colonies, Virginia, Maryland, the Carolinas, Georgia. The South presented a more complex picture. Settled areas along the coast maintained order through a hierarchical social system enforced by wealthy planters who controlled local offices. But the southern frontier, vast, sparsely populated, and poorly governed, became notorious for violence and lawlessness. Homicide rates in frontier regions were significantly higher than in settled areas. Frontier versus settled communities. Across all regions, the critical distinction was between established communities and frontier areas. Settled towns with stable populations, functioning institutions, and strong social networks maintained relatively low crime rates. Frontier areas, with transient populations, weak governance, and social disruption, experienced significantly more crime and violence. Colonial court records reveal patterns in what crimes were most common and most prosecuted. Property crimes, theft, burglary, livestock stealing. These were the most frequently prosecuted crimes in most colonies. However, rates were generally lower than in contemporary European cities. The relatively equal distribution of land in many northern colonies meant fewer desperately poor people driven to theft. Violent crimes, assault, murder. Serious interpersonal violence was prosecuted vigorously, but occurred relatively infrequently in settled communities. Tavern brawls and personal disputes resulted in assaults, but calculated violence was uncommon. Homicide, particularly premeditated murder, was rare enough to be shocking when it occurred. Moral offenses, fornication, adultery, Sabbath breaking, drunkenness. These crimes consumed enormous amounts of court time, particularly in Puritan New England. Their prosecution reflected communities' priorities. Social and moral order mattered as much or more than preventing violence or theft. Slave-related offenses. The enslaved population faced systematic violence that was legal and therefore not recorded as crime. Meanwhile, slave resistance, ranging from theft to escape to rebellion, was criminalized and prosecuted harshly. This racial dimension of colonial crime distorts any simple comparison with modern crime rates. Several factors influenced colonial crime rates. Economic opportunity. In regions where land was available and economic opportunity existed, property crime remained relatively low. Desperation-driven theft was less common than in densely populated European cities with large populations of landless poor. Social cohesion. Tight-knit communities where everyone knew everyone else's business created powerful informal controls on behavior. The shame of community disapproval was often more deterring than legal punishment. Religious culture. In areas with strong religious communities, particularly Puritan New England and Quaker Pennsylvania, religious teachings and church discipline supplemented legal controls. Demographic factors. Colonial America had a relatively young, male-dominated population, demographics typically associated with higher crime rates. Yet this was offset by other factors like economic opportunity and social control. When we ask whether colonial America had high or low crime rates, the question is, compared to what? Compared to modern America? Compared to contemporary Europe? Compared to what we might expect given the absence of professional police? The answer depends on which comparison we make, and reveals that the relationship between formal law enforcement and crime rates is far more complex than simple assumptions suggest. Plymouth Colony, founded by the Pilgrims in 1620, provides perhaps the best example of a colonial community that maintained remarkably low crime rates without any formal police force. Plymouth remained small throughout its existence, never exceeding about 7,000 people, before merging with Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1691. The population was relatively homogeneous, primarily English Protestants who shared religious beliefs and cultural values. Most families owned land and engaged in agriculture or trade, creating a society with minimal economic desperation. Governance was communal and direct. Town meetings made collective decisions. Every adult male was expected to participate in law enforcement through the watch system and by responding to the hue and cry when crimes occurred. Officials, governors, assistants, and constables were elected from within the community and served without significant compensation. Analysis of Plymouth Colony court records by historians including John Demos reveals strikingly low rates of serious crime. Between 1620 and 1691, Plymouth Colony recorded only a handful of murder convictions. In a population that grew from dozens to thousands over 70 years, murder was extraordinarily rare. The most infamous case was John Billington's murder of John Newcomen in 1630, notable precisely because it was so shocking and unusual. Property crime occurred but remained relatively uncommon. Most theft cases involved small amounts: tools, food, clothing. Grand larceny, theft of goods worth more than a shilling, was rare enough that each case received significant attention. Many theft cases were handled through restitution rather than punishment, with thieves required to repay victims, often at double or triple the value stolen. Interpersonal violence occurred, typically arising from personal disputes, drunkenness, or family conflicts. But serious assaults were uncommon, and when they occurred, community pressure often resulted in reconciliation rather than prosecution. The Plymouth court records are dominated not by theft or violence but by moral offenses: fornication, sex before marriage, adultery, drunkenness, Sabbath breaking, and lewd behavior. These offenses consumed more court time than all property and violent crimes combined. Why was crime so low? Several factors explain Plymouth's low crime rates. Everyone knew everyone. Anonymity, which facilitates crime, barely existed. The shame of community disapproval was a powerful deterrent. Most families owned land and could support themselves. While poverty existed, desperate destitution was uncommon, removing a major driver of property crime. Puritan theology emphasized moral behavior and community accountability. Church discipline supplemented legal enforcement. The threat of excommunication or being read out of church carried serious social consequences. While not prohibited, alcohol consumption was regulated. Taverns required licenses, drunkenness was punished, and the community actively discouraged excessive drinking, eliminating a major contributor to violent crime. Strong, stable families provided social support and supervision. Young men, the demographic most likely to commit crimes, were typically under parental or master's authority as apprentices or servants, providing structure and accountability. When crimes did occur, punishment was swift and public. The certainty of being caught and punished, given the lack of anonymity, likely deterred some would-be criminals. Plymouth's low crime rates came with costs that modern observers should acknowledge. The same mechanisms that prevented crime also created an oppressive environment of constant surveillance and judgment. Individual privacy barely existed. Nonconformists faced persecution. The community could dictate behavior in ways modern Americans would find intolerable: whom you could drink with, how you spent Sundays, even aspects of family life. Those who didn't fit community norms were pushed out. Plymouth's low crime rates were partly achieved by excluding or expelling undesirable people. Domestic violence and violence against servants likely occurred, but went largely unrecorded because it was considered private or acceptable. Plymouth Colony demonstrates that communities without professional police can maintain very low rates of serious crime, but only under specific conditions: small size, homogeneity, economic stability, strong social cohesion, and at significant costs to individual liberty and privacy. Whether such a model could scale to larger, more diverse populations is doubtful. If Plymouth represents a best-case scenario for colonial law enforcement, Philadelphia represents something closer to average: a growing colonial city that maintained order reasonably well despite increasing size, diversity, and the challenges of urban life. Founded by William Penn in 1682 as a holy experiment in Quaker governance, Philadelphia grew rapidly to become colonial America's largest city. By 1775, it had approximately 40,000 inhabitants, a diverse population including Quakers, Anglicans, Presbyterians, Germans, Scots-Irish, free blacks, and enslaved people. This size and diversity created challenges unknown in small homogeneous communities like Plymouth. Anonymity became possible. Social control through community pressure weakened. Economic inequality increased, creating a population of poor laborers, sailors, and transients. Analysis of Philadelphia court records and newspaper accounts by historians including Roger Lane and Alan Steinberg reveals patterns of urban crime. Philadelphia experienced regular property crime, particularly theft and burglary. The waterfront area, with its taverns, boarding houses, and transient population of sailors, became known for pickpocketing and theft. Unlike Plymouth, where victims often knew thieves and could seek restitution, Urban anonymity made solving property crimes difficult. A 1749 Pennsylvania Gazette article complained, "Our streets are become dangerous to pass in of late, scarce a night passes but some persons are struck down, others knocked down, others have their pockets picked." This suggests crime was common enough to be a public concern. Assaults occurred with some frequency, often in tavern districts and often involving alcohol. However, homicide remained relatively rare. Philadelphia averaged perhaps 25 murders per year in the mid-18th century, a rate of roughly 512 per 100,000 residents. This is higher than Plymouth, but lower than many modern American cities. Philadelphia developed more sophisticated forms of crime unknown in rural areas. Counterfeiting operations, organized theft rings, and professional criminals began to appear. The city's commerce and anonymity created opportunities for systematic criminal enterprise. Philadelphia's approach to law enforcement evolved as the city grew. Initially a volunteer system, it was reformed in 1751 to become a paid service. Watchmen patrolled streets at night, called out the hours, watched for fires, and detained suspicious persons. By the 1760s, the watch numbered about 50 men, grossly inadequate for a city of 40,000. Unpaid citizens serving annual terms, constables had daytime responsibility for keeping order. Like watchmen, they were poorly trained and often incompetent or corrupt. Philadelphia experienced what contemporary observers called a crime wave in the early 1750s. Newspapers reported increasing burglaries and street robberies. Concerned citizens formed voluntary patrol groups. The legislature reformed the night watch, making it professional and expanding its size. This response reveals important patterns. Crime did increase as cities grew, communities recognized the inadequacy of amateur law enforcement, and reforms moved toward more professional systems even before the Revolution. How does Philadelphia's crime rate compare? Philadelphia was significantly safer than London, which in the mid-1700s had much higher rates of property crime and violence. London's larger size, greater poverty, and anonymity created more crime opportunities. Philadelphia clearly had higher crime rates than rural communities in the same colony. Urban conditions, anonymity, poverty, transience, created more crime. Estimating colonial Philadelphia's homicide rate at roughly 512 per 100,000. This is significantly lower than modern Philadelphia's rate, which has ranged from 1530 per 100,000 in recent decades depending on the year. Philadelphia's experience suggests several conclusions. Even in colonial America, urban areas had higher crime rates than rural communities. This isn't primarily about police presence, it's about social conditions. The informal mechanisms that worked in Plymouth couldn't scale to Philadelphia's size. As communities grew, pressure increased for more formal, professional law enforcement. Even with amateur law enforcement, Philadelphia maintained order reasonably well. Crime existed but didn't create social collapse. The movement toward professional policing began in the colonial period, as communities recognized the limitations of amateur systems. It wasn't a sudden 19th century innovation, but a gradual evolution. If Plymouth demonstrates that communities without police could maintain low crime rates, and Philadelphia shows that urban areas faced more challenges but managed adequately, the southern frontier demonstrates where informal justice completely broke down. The backcountry regions of Virginia and the Carolinas in the 18th century represented the opposite of Plymouth's stable, cohesive community. Settlers lived on isolated farms separated by miles of wilderness. Courts were distant, meeting infrequently, churches were rare, government barely existed. Many frontier residents were rootless, failed farmers from the east, indentured servants who had completed their terms, refugees from debt or legal trouble. Land ownership was often disputed. Many settlers were squatters with no legal title. Economic desperation was common. The frontier attracted diverse groups: Scots-Irish, Germans, former convicts, Native Americans, with different cultural norms and languages. Contemporary accounts and court records, when they exist, paint a picture of endemic violence and disorder. Homicide rates on the southern frontier appear to have been significantly higher than in settled areas, perhaps 2050 per 100,000 or higher. Historian Bertram Wyatt Brown's research suggests that southern frontier culture valorized personal honor and violent retaliation, leading to frequent deadly confrontations. As explored in previous episodes, frontier areas became havens for outlaws. The Natchez Trace, the Carolina Backcountry, and the Virginia-North Carolina border region all developed reputations for highway robbery and organized crime. With courts distant and ineffective, frontier residents often took justice into their own hands, but this frequently meant personal vendettas, feuds, and vigilante violence rather than organized community justice. The failure of informal justice on the frontier prompted extralegal responses. The regulator movements in North Carolina, 1768 to 1771, and South Carolina, 1767 to 1769, represent attempts by frontier settlers to create order when government failed to provide it. Frustrated by rampant crime and complete absence of courts in the backcountry, settlers formed regulator groups that hunted bandits, whipped thieves, and forcibly expelled undesirable people. While they reduced some crime, they also committed serious abuses, torturing suspects, destroying property, and persecuting political enemies. These regulators focused more on corrupt officials than on criminals, but their movement similarly arose from government failure to provide justice. Their rebellion against corrupt courts and officials culminated in the Battle of Alamance, 1771, where colonial militia defeated the regulators. What failed on the frontier? The frontier experience demonstrates the conditions under which informal justice breaks down. When people don't know their neighbors, community pressure becomes ineffective. Transient populations don't invest in community order. When courts are too distant to be effective, legal justice becomes unavailable. When many people have little to lose, deterrence weakens. When diverse groups with different norms coexist without consensus, shared standards of behavior break down. The frontier's high crime rates weren't primarily caused by lack of police. They were caused by social conditions that made informal controls ineffective. But the absence of any formal law enforcement alternative meant no backup system existed when informal controls failed. The evidence from colonial America presents a paradox. Communities without professional police often maintained lower crime rates than modern communities with extensive law enforcement, but only under specific conditions and with significant variations. In small, stable, homogeneous communities with strong social cohesion and economic opportunity, like Plymouth, or rural New England towns, or established southern plantations, crime rates remained remarkably low. These communities demonstrate that formal police aren't necessary for social order when powerful informal controls exist. Everyone watched everyone, making concealing crimes difficult. The shame and social consequences of criminal behavior deterred many potential offenders. When most people could support themselves, desperation-driven crime remained uncommon. Shared values about right and wrong provided common standards of behavior. These mechanisms worked so well that some historians argue these communities were overregulated, that the same social controls that prevented crime also oppressed individual freedom and punished harmless nonconformity. In urban areas, on frontiers, and in socially diverse communities, informal controls weakened. Anonymity made social pressure less effective. Transience meant people didn't invest in community order. Diversity eliminated consensus about norms and values. Poverty and inequality increased desperation-driven crime. In these contexts, the absence of formal law enforcement created real problems. Crime increased. Informal justice often degenerated into vigilantism or mob violence, and the most vulnerable populations, the poor, minorities, women, had little protection. Colonial America's relatively low crime rates in some communities came with costs modern observers should acknowledge. Constant surveillance and harsh punishment of moral offenses created societies where individual privacy and freedom were minimal. Crime rates appeared low partly because much interpersonal violence, domestic abuse, violence against servants and enslaved people, sexual assault, went unreported and unpunished. Communities maintained order partly by excluding or expelling undesirable people, the poor, nonconformists, minorities, who then became someone else's problem. Low crime rates for the white community sometimes depended on brutal control of enslaved and poor populations through violence that was legal and therefore not counted as crime. Did colonial America's lack of police cause its crime patterns? The evidence suggests a more complex relationship. Communities with low crime rates didn't have low crime because they lacked police. They had low crime because of social conditions, cohesion, stability, opportunity that made crime less likely. Communities with high crime rates didn't have high crime primarily because they lacked police. They had high crime because of social conditions, anonymity, transience, poverty, conflict, that weakened informal controls. The absence of formal police became problematic not because it caused crime, but because it meant no backup system existed when informal controls failed. Colonial crime patterns set trajectories that continued into the 19th century. Cities developed professional police forces decades before rural areas because urban conditions made informal controls less effective. The South's hierarchical social structure and reliance on violent control of enslaved populations created different law enforcement patterns than the North's more commercial, diverse society. As frontier areas became settled communities, crime rates typically decreased, not because formal law enforcement arrived, but because social stability and institutions developed. The colonial experience thus suggests that while police can be useful, especially in urban areas and diverse societies, they're neither necessary for low crime rates nor sufficient to create them. Crime rates depend primarily on social conditions. Law enforcement is one tool among many for maintaining order. Colonial America's experience challenges modern assumptions about the relationship between police and crime rates. We often assume that more police equals less crime, that law enforcement is the primary factor preventing criminal behavior. But colonial America demonstrates that communities can maintain low crime rates without professional police when social conditions support informal controls. This historical insight connects to modern debates about police and public safety. Modern research increasingly shows that social conditions, poverty, inequality, family stability, community cohesion, economic opportunity, affect crime rates more powerfully than police presence. This echoes what colonial experience demonstrated. Plymouth's low crime rates resulted from social cohesion and economic stability, not from effective law enforcement. Just as colonial constables couldn't create social order in frontier regions with high transience and weak social bonds, modern police struggle to reduce crime in communities with severe poverty, family breakdown, and social disorganization. Policing alone can't solve problems rooted in social conditions. Colonial Philadelphia maintained order reasonably well with about 50 watchmen for 40,000 residents, roughly one officer per 800 people. Modern Philadelphia has roughly one officer per 200 residents, but struggles with higher crime rates. This suggests that the relationship between police numbers and crime is nonlinear and depends on broader social context. The colonial experience also informs modern discussions about alternatives to traditional policing. Some modern reformers advocate community-based approaches to addressing harm and conflict, restorative justice, mediation, community accountability. Colonial communities routinely used these methods. The Plymouth Colony evidence shows these approaches can work for many offenses, but also reveals their limitations: oppressive social control, exclusion of nonconformists, inability to handle serious violence. Neighborhood watch programs and community organizing reflect colonial-era reliance on informal social control. But colonial experience warns that informal controls work best in small, homogeneous communities and can become oppressive or discriminatory. Modern calls to reduce police sometimes prompt concerns about vigilantism. Colonial and early American history shows these concerns aren't baseless. When formal law enforcement is absent or weak, vigilante violence often emerges. The South Carolina regulators demonstrate both the appeal and the dangers of community-organized enforcement. What police actually do. Colonial experience also highlights what professional police provide that informal systems don't. Specialized investigation. Complex crimes, fraud, organized crime, serial offenses require professional investigation. Colonial communities struggled with sophisticated criminals. Impartial enforcement. Professional police can theoretically enforce laws impartially. Community-based justice often reflected local prejudices and power dynamics. Protection for outsiders. Informal social control works for community members but often excludes or persecutes outsiders. Police, again, theoretically, protect everyone equally. Accountability mechanisms. While police accountability remains imperfect, professional departments offer more oversight than informal vigilante groups. Colonial America forces us to confront a fundamental question. What is the purpose of law enforcement? If the goal is simply low crime rates, colonial America demonstrates that formal police aren't always necessary. Social conditions matter more. But if the goal is individual rights, equal protection, and justice that doesn't depend on conformity to community norms, then colonial America shows the limitations of informal systems. Modern Americans must choose what they value: the oppressive social control that kept Plymouth's crime rates low, the incomplete protection that left Philadelphia vulnerable, the frontier chaos when informal controls failed, or formal systems that, while imperfect, at least aspire to treat everyone equally. Colonial America's lack of police didn't automatically create high crime, but it meant communities had no backup when informal controls failed, no protection for those outside the community consensus, and no check on majority tyranny. The development of professional policing addressed real problems, even as it created new ones. The challenge for modern society is learning from both colonial successes, the power of community cohesion and social conditions, and colonial failures, the dangers of informal justice, and the need for formal protections, to create systems that maintain order while protecting rights, something colonial America never fully achieved. We've reached the end of a 30-episode journey through crime, justice, and law enforcement in colonial and early America, a journey that challenges many of our assumptions about police, crime, and social order. The question we asked at the beginning, did colonial America's lack of police lead to higher crime rates? Turns out to have a frustratingly complex answer. It depends. In stable, cohesive communities like Plymouth Colony, crime rates were remarkably low without professional police. Social cohesion, economic stability, and shared values created powerful informal controls that prevented most serious crime. These communities demonstrate that formal police aren't necessary for social order when the right social conditions exist. In growing cities like Philadelphia, crime increased as anonymity and diversity weakened informal controls. Yet even with amateur law enforcement, colonial cities maintained reasonable order, crime rates that were often lower than in modern American cities despite having far fewer resources devoted to law enforcement. On the frontier, where social conditions made informal controls ineffective and no formal alternative existed, crime flourished and violence became endemic. These regions demonstrate what happens when neither informal nor formal controls work, a cautionary tale about assuming communities can always self-regulate. Throughout this series, we've seen patterns that should inform modern debates. social conditions matter more than police presence for determining crime rates. Informal social control can be effective but often at the cost of individual freedom and rights. Different communities need different approaches to law enforcement. The absence of police isn't the same as the absence of law enforcement. Colonial communities had constables, sheriffs, watches, militias, and vigilantes. Crime rates are just one measure of justice. Low crime rates that depend on oppression, exclusion, or turning a blind eye to certain victims aren't success stories. Perhaps most importantly, we've learned that the relationship between law enforcement and crime is far more complex than simple cause and effect. Police are neither the magic solution that prevents all crime nor unnecessary institutions that communities can easily do without. They're one tool among many for maintaining order, useful under some conditions, problematic under others, and always embedded in broader social contexts that shape their effectiveness. As modern America continues to debate police reform, community alternatives, and public safety strategies, the lessons from colonial and early American history remain relevant. Focus on creating social conditions that prevent crime, maintain multiple mechanisms for addressing harm and conflict, build systems that protect rights while maintaining order, and remember that there are always trade-offs between different approaches to justice. What do you think? After 30 episodes examining how early Americans dealt with crime without modern police forces, what lessons seem most relevant today? What surprised you most about colonial crime and justice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for joining us on this comprehensive exploration of crime and justice in early America. If you found this series valuable, please like, subscribe, and share these episodes with others interested in the complex history of American law enforcement. Your engagement helps us continue creating in-depth historical documentaries. Until next time, stay curious about history.